So I thought I would come back onto YouTube here and start shooting videos regularly that would be shorter, maybe a little more to the point, a little more punchy. And then this topic drops in my lap and we've got to talk about it. So in this video, we're going to be talking about psychedelic therapists who are using non-duality or mystical experiences or oneness experiences in a way that's ending up hurting their clients. And I want to share my thoughts about it with you. So just a little bit of context here. I keep hearing about this pattern over and over and over of psychedelic therapists who are pushing their clients into non-dual type experiences. In other words, mystical experiences, oneness experiences, with the assumption or the hope that if they can get their client to have this experience, it will somehow heal their trauma. Okay. Now, what ends up happening for a lot of these clients, and some of these people have come to work with me, or I'm seeing reports about this online, it's a pattern, it's a trend that I'm seeing. What happens to a lot of these people is that they don't end up having a mystical experience. And instead, the push to get to that state ends up becoming a wounding or piece of damaging pressure for them, and ends up complicating the therapeutic relationship or causing people to have a complete kind of breakdown in their ability to trust the process and the therapist. Now, we're going to unpack all of this in this video. I want to share my thoughts about it, and I do have some nuanced thoughts about it here, but I wanted to just kind of share this with you. And I got to admit, this is a bit of a weird one for me to be talking about because of my own personal history with non-duality and how passionate I am about the topic. And even if you look back on my post history here on the channel, you will see me talking about the use of non-duality in psychedelic therapy. So it's something that I'm familiar with. It's something I'm trained in and experienced with. It's something I have a love and a passion for. But we really have to be looking here at if this is causing damage for people, why? And what are kind of the dynamics at play here? And ultimately, is this perhaps unethical? So that's kind of what I want to explore in this video with you. So join me if that interests you. So before we go ahead and really get into the nitty gritty here, I want to just give the obligatory caveats here that are really well deserved. So let's be clear. First of all, there are a lot of psychedelic therapists out there who are highly ethical, who are doing incredible work, who are deeply compassionate and doing profound, heroic therapeutic work. Some are above ground and known or licensed or legal-ish. Others are underground and doing this totally covertly. And they deserve to be praised and honored for doing the right thing in the right way. Okay. Also, I'm a huge fan of non-duality. Like I said, in general, it is a huge part of my own personal history and my own life. And this is in no means meant to disparage the non-dualist community or non-dual practices or mysticism or, any of that. I think that's all profoundly important and beautiful and necessary, and I have the deepest, deepest respect for those traditions. Other thing I want to say here is that, there's always damaging therapists from any walk of therapy. Okay. There's malpractice in pretty much any field, if we want to be honest about it. Right. So let's not confuse the forest for the trees here, and that there are a certain set of therapists who are perhaps being unethical or too aggressive in their approach and wounding their clients. Doesn't mean that all therapists are bad. Doesn't mean that all psychedelic therapists are bad. Again, it's just really important that we get clear about that, and that I say that. There are a lot of people out there, again, doing their best work here, and that really deserves to be, again, upheld and honored and acknowledged as we put the spotlight on kind of this one particular shady angle on things. Okay, so enough said. Hopefully you get me on that. Let's go ahead and get into it. So first, let's start with defining non-duality. Now, this is a tricky topic to define because in the non-dualist community, broadly speaking, or the traditions from which non-duality comes, there are different languages and ways to describe this. There are even probably different kind of gradients or types of non-duality, types of oneness experiences. So I'm kind of being a bit rough and sloppy with my language here, so please forgive that, but it's just kind of the easiest term to grab for here. Basically, when I'm saying non-duality, what I mean, broadly speaking, is some sort of oneness, all one type experience. So this is, generally speaking, we could also think of this as ego death. We could think of this as a mystical experience. again, these are all roughly synonyms if we're not getting into the particulars of that. That basically means that a person has a type of spiritual experience where the internal subjective felt experience of self kind of dissolves. That boundary of self and perception of world and other and cosmos dissolves. And the person essentially has an experience of melting into the light of the universe or the energy of the universe or the sense of everything around the person, and totally immerses their sense of self into everything. So there's a full loss of a sense of identity or a sense of ego or a sense of distinction of a distinct separate me or I from my environment and from the rest of life. Broadly speaking, that's the kind of experience we're talking about. Again, there's different language for this. There may be different kind of gradients or tiers of non-dual experience. But roughly speaking, that's kind of the experience we're talking about. So we're talking about a full dissolution of the ego into just pure energy, pure consciousness, pure light, more or less. Let me just give you a little bit of my own personal history here. So I forget if I've shared this on the channel or not yet. I had my first non-dual experience when I was 17. Long story short, had a friend who discovered the Psychedelic Experience, which is a book by Timothy Leary and Ram Dass and Ralph Metzner, where they basically transcribed or transposed or retranslated the Tibetan Book of the Dead to be used as a manual for ego dissolution and rebirth during a psychedelic experience. I had that read to me again when I was 17, and it was one of the definitive life-changing moments in my personal history. It completely rewrote the script for me with a lot of the questions that I didn't even know I was carrying in my heart and in my mind at the time of, is there a God? Is there a soul? Is there an afterlife? What more is there to life than what I'm already perceiving and understanding? What is the deeper nature of psychedelics? What is the deeper nature of this mystery in the universe? It really put all of those questions at ease and delivered me with one of the most profound, beautiful, transformative, life-affirming, again, totally life-defining experiences for which I am deeply grateful, for which I celebrate my friend for having the courage to suggest this and offer this up, and for which it really is one of the major blessings in my life. So for me, it also, side note, while I'm thinking about it here, completely taught me how to work with psychedelics properly, I think, how to really understand how to let go into the psychedelic experience and completely open up to it, and really formatted my understanding of spirituality, my understanding of self, my understanding of cosmos around me, and really formatted my understanding of psychedelics. So done properly, and I feel like it was a pretty proper experience I had, done properly, a mystical experience can be an absolutely pivotal, life-changing, transformative, there's no words for it, beauty and profundity and amazing and all of that does not do justice to the depth of that experience. Okay. So for me, it's one of the things that if I want to make myself feel deeply grateful, I can just think about that and I will be flooded with a sense of gratitude and chills up and down my spine and like a deep, deep, deep gratitude for life. So that's the kind of experience we're talking about here. It is profoundly impactful if done properly. Okay. And so for me, it's a little odd to be talking about or even thinking about or looking at therapists misusing this profoundly deep experience in a way that ends up harming clients. But I want to explain to you what I'm seeing and my thoughts about it, because you should know in case you end up with one of these therapists, and you should know in case you're interested in non-duality, how it could also be used in a way that's harmful. So that's why I'm talking about this. But just so you know, I'm coming from a place of firsthand experience with this. And that one at 17 was just the first of many, many, many non-dual experiences I have had through my life, both with the medicines, also in meditation practices, retreats, you name it. This is something I've pursued very deeply in my life. So it's something I'm intimately familiar with. And so that's where I'm speaking from as I share everything I'm about to share here. So please get, I am a lover of mystical experiences. I am a fan. I'm a cheerleader of mystical experiences, deeply grateful for my own, and something that I've, really leaned into. Okay. So I know you get it. So again, next section. Okay. So to explain the problem just a little bit in more depth here, what I'm hearing about and seeing a lot is either psychedelic therapists or guides who are either trained or untrained, often pushing people, kind of encouraging and creating this like goal orientation of trying to push their clients into a non-dual experience, into this oneness experience that I just described to you. And often this becomes the focal point or the reason for the psychedelic therapy, which on one level makes sense because this is a feature of psychedelics. The higher you go in the dose, generally the more likely you are to have a non-dual experience. So it's logical on one level, but there's this overall sense of this is what's going to fix you, this is what's going to heal you, and really pushing people towards this. And often the people I'm hearing about this from tend to be people who are dealing with a fair amount of anxiety, fear, trauma, dysregulation in their nervous system. These are generally people who are already having a bit of a rougher time just functioning normally and or having a rougher time in normal therapy. And then there's these therapists essentially pushing them to have this big peak experience with the medicine. So roughly speaking, this is kind of what we're seeing. And there are certain psychedelic therapy models that are built around this, that this is actually fundamentally what we're trying to get people to experience. And I can speak to that again from my own early experience of this. But that's roughly what we're seeing here. It's like this like push, this like intentional, like trying to almost force or cajole or, pull people into essentially an awakening, a spiritual experience, a God experience, a oneness experience, which is, could be understood from different lenses. We're going to unpack this more, but it's just on its face kind of an odd, strange thing to do. But let me break down a little bit why I think this might be happening, some of the aspects of what is going on here, and give my thoughts about it. Okay, so to explain the problem just a little bit in more depth here, what I'm hearing about and seeing a lot is either psychedelic therapists or guides who are either trained or untrained, often pushing people, kind of encouraging and creating this like goal orientation of trying to push their clients into a non-dual experience, into this oneness experience that I just described to you. And often this becomes the focal point or the reason for the psychedelic therapy, which on one level makes sense because this is a feature of psychedelics. The higher you go in the dose, generally the more likely you are to have a non-dual experience. So it's logical on one level, but there's this overall sense of this is what's going to fix you, this is what's going to heal you, and really pushing people towards this. And often the people I'm hearing about this from tend to be people who are dealing with a fair amount of anxiety, fear, trauma, dysregulation in their nervous system. These are generally people who are already having a bit of a rougher time just functioning normally and or having a rougher time in normal therapy. And then there's these therapists essentially pushing them to have this big peak experience with the medicine. So roughly speaking, this is kind of what we're seeing. And there are certain psychedelic therapy models that are built around this, that this is actually fundamentally what we're trying to get people to experience. And I can speak to that again from my own early experience of this. But that's roughly what we're seeing here. It's like this like push, this like intentional, like trying to almost force or cajole or, pull people into essentially an awakening, a spiritual experience, a God experience, a oneness experience, which is, could be understood from different lenses. We're going to unpack this more, but it's just on its face kind of an odd, strange thing to do. But let me break down a little bit why I think this might be happening, some of the aspects of what is going on here, and give my thoughts about it. So I don't know this for a fact because I haven't talked to any of these therapists directly and kind of interviewed them and asked them where they're coming from and gotten their side of this. So this is all kind of me sharing and reporting on a phenomenon that I'm getting more from the client side, less from the therapist side. Okay, so let's be fair here about that. My best guess is that one of the major reasons for this is that there's been some science that's come out in the last 10 years or so, 15 years or so, that shows a lot of promise just purely with, say, psilocybin, purely with psychedelics, where if people do have a mystical experience, if they, just by the medicine, not induced or led or, directed by the therapist, but, blindfold, study model, feed the person 6 grams of mushrooms or whatever it is, and they end up having a mystical experience, the mental health outcomes are robust, right? In other words, it tends to create a longer effect of buffering against depression or anxiety. It tends to be considered one of the most profound, important experiences of a person's life, changes death anxiety in a big way, etc. It can be very, very beneficial in the study data, right? But again, let's remember the people in the study data, generally speaking, organically had this experience. They were not being cajoled or forced or led into that experience. It just happened for them, which is, again, on 6 grams of mushrooms, not an unlikely thing to happen. That's very possible, right? So I think part of why we're seeing this arise as a model and an approach to therapy, the beginning of understanding that is because these therapists are looking at that data and wanting to replicate that with the intention, which is probably a very positive intention or hope, that it's going to really robustly resource the client and help them to truly heal or transform whatever this trauma is that they're dealing with. Again, I'm guessing here. I don't know this for a fact. I haven't talked to any of the therapists in question to get their track on it. But if I had to wager a guess, this is where I would start. Now, another reason why this could be happening, and again, this is just my own guess here because, again, I haven't spoken to any of these therapists, is that when you first have a mystical experience or you get comfortable and familiar with the deep end of psychedelics and going really deep with them, and you start to have this sense of spirituality and it really kind of reframes your understanding of life, there can arise a certain kind of flavor of zealotry. Okay, there can be this kind of passionate certainty and assertiveness that this is the way and this is right and this is how it's supposed to be. And it can really turn into like a dogmatism, again, a zealotry. Now, I think what might also be happening here is that some of these therapists are kind of newer to psychedelics. Again, I had my first one at 17. It was in the earlier end of the 90s. So it was a long time ago. Okay. So I've had the good fortune to integrate that a long time ago into my being. But some of these therapists might be kind of newer to these medicines, newer to mystical experiences. And it's like a kid with a new toy that is just so exciting. And there's so much passion there. There's so much meaning there. There's scientific data that backs this up. And I could see a scenario where a therapist like that, and let's be clear, there are a lot of psychedelic therapists who are new to the medicine. Okay. Let's be clear. At least in the US here, with all the trainings going on, there are a lot of therapists who have been therapists for a long time and maybe psychedelic curious who are hopping on board over the last 5-10 years, new to the medicines, trying to wrap their heads around it, trying to get trained around it, trying to also, get skillful enough that they can have a certain kind of expertise or gravitas to what they're talking about. And so we have a lot of psychedelic therapists out there who are pretty new to this territory. Okay. And so I really think that potentially part of what's going on here is that we have therapists who are having these experiences, developing a passion for these experiences, developing a conviction that this is the way forward. This is how you heal people, is with these kind of deep, soul level spiritual experiences. And then they're kind of building models that push for that. Okay. So again, hazarding a guess here. I don't know that for a fact, but that kind of adds up with what I'm seeing essentially. Okay, another reason why this could be happening, and this gets a little finger pointy, so I want to be careful how I put this, is that therapists often struggle with resistance and defenses in clients. This is kind of like one of the major skills of becoming a therapist is understanding unconscious and semi-conscious resistance to therapy from clients, resistance to healing, resistance to change. And there are a lot of therapists out there who are underskilled in navigating resistance. And quite frankly, if you're dealing with a lot of resistant clients or even just a resistant client who's very robust in their resistance, it can be exhausting, frustrating, it can go in circles, it can be confusing, it can be disappointing. It can also be hard on the therapist because the therapist is in the role of holding the vision of healing and hope for the client, because a lot of times the client is the client, at least in part, because they don't believe they can heal or they don't have a vision of hope for their own healing yet. And part of the therapist's job is to help co-create that with the client, at least from certain schools of therapy. I don't want to speak for all models of therapy and all therapists. Again, caveats, generalizations, you know what I mean. But this is a real thing where there are a lot of therapists that quite frankly struggle and aren't very skillful with addressing resistance properly. It can be hard. It can be confusing. There's many schools of thought on what you do with defenses and resistance. And it really gets into challenging your own personality and how centered you are as a person while you're trying to help someone who came to you for help, but also is then resisting you as you're trying to help them. Like it does invite frustration, and obviously the therapist can't really reasonably get frustrated at the client. So all this is to say, one of the reasons this might be happening is that it's perhaps an attempt to take the client way past their ego and therefore way past all their defense systems. And it might be a way that unskillful therapists who don't have a good model or a good understanding of what to do with resistance, it might be one way that they're kind of trying to, again, crowbar their way past it, push past it, and just kind of, blow right over it and destroy the resistance and get the person to the resource place that they want to get them to, or get them to the cathartic moment that they want to get them to. So again, I don't know this for a fact, but it would make sense to me. I know, and again, it's a bit of a secret. It's a bit of a shady thing that I'm kind of outing here. Again, that a lot of therapists don't know what to do with resistance, even their own, right? And so could be that this is a solution to that. Apologies. I wanted to add a couple more points here about resistance that I forgot to say in the last section. So really quickly here, a couple other points I want to make. First of all is that the amount of training that therapists have, especially with dealing with the deep end of things, if we're talking about people who have trauma and need healing with trauma, it's not universal. There are a lot of therapists who only train perhaps in one modality or in a couple modalities, and they're kind of ready to work with clients, but also really actually very underprepared and actually only see things through one or two lenses, which kind of equates in the therapy world to the idea of all you have is a hammer, all you see is nails, right? So they may be undertrained or not broadly trained, right? And this is really important to understand that the amount of training in therapists varies widely, okay? There are therapists out there who are like grand wizards of understanding human experience and emotions and psychology and are geniuses at dealing with people and relating to people. Like those people exist, and thank God for them, right? But at the same time, there's also a lot of therapists out there, some have been in their careers for a long time, who never developed that skill or don't have the knack or never dug deep or never aggressively pursued more training. They just kind of, rode on whatever little bit of training they had, or also we see, yeah, right. Another important point I want to make. A lot of therapists, like a shocking amount, and this is true for coaches and hypnotherapists and people working to serve you. A lot of these people have not done their own attachment healing work, right? So it's entirely possible for you to go to a therapist who has a wounded attachment style themselves and does not recognize the way that their attachment style is distorting their lens of understanding how to relate to their clients. Really important point. Okay. So not only do we have a bunch of therapists out there who vary in training, but a lot of therapists who haven't done their own healing work. And their job is to relate to other people in a very specific, supportive way that, again, supports the process of healing, right? Supports the process of change or transformation or resolution, however you want to think of that. So this is another major, major issue is therapists with, say, an avoidant attachment style or an anxious attachment style, projecting those attachment wounds onto the relationship they have with their clients and letting that inform the kinds of choices they make, which may make them to make choices that are absolutely incorrect for what the client needs in terms of healing. Okay, important point. Remember that. Another guess I have about this is that perhaps it's just simply the joy and the excitement of this new tool in the toolkit in terms of psychedelics entering into the therapeutic landscape. So something that's, again, kind of hush-hush, it's a little bit of a dirty secret in the therapy world, but it's also mentioned, is that in a lot of ways, therapy has been kind of stagnant for a long time now. A lot of the therapy skills, I mean, there are cutting edges of therapy that I think have been profound over the last 30 years. But in a lot of ways, up until the psychedelic revolution, therapy is being considered fairly stagnant. There's been a lot of dependence on medication and SSRIs, which are, problematic in a lot of ways. Same with benzos, et cetera, right? And so therapy's kind of backed itself into a corner of not scaling well, not serving people to the depth they need, and also just in general kind of stagnating in terms of power and technique and ability. So it's entirely possible that another reason we're seeing these kinds of negative side effects from misuse of these psychedelic technologies is just that they're new in the landscape. And there are a lot of people, therapists and, thought leaders and scientists and whatnot who are just not quite well tuned in to how to work with these medicines yet. And again, are just excited to have the new tool and are perhaps being overly aggressive with these tools. So another important point to think about. And I want to add a perspective here that doesn't get spoken about a lot in terms of non-duality, especially in the West, especially in the modern, Western world. When we're looking at these traditions, the way that people came to have non-dual experiences traditionally, right? If we're looking at esoteric traditions, say from the Buddhist world or the Hindu world or other traditions that would involve some sort of a practice that leads to a non-dual experience, a oneness experience, a mystical experience, these kinds of things. There are generally a couple ways that would go down historically and traditionally, okay? And maybe these are wise traditions and an important thing to consider here, right? So one way that this often goes down is that people would be organically called to pursue these kinds of experiences, as perhaps part of spiritual practice or part of the goal of attaining a high level of awakening and consciousness and ultimately enlightenment, right? In the true enlightenment traditions, this is a calling. This is something that often people would long for and desire, and there would be an internal knowing that I want to pursue this. I'm choosing this for its own ends, for its own sake. I'm not choosing this because some therapist told me that this would be the thing I need in order to heal my trauma and get over my early childhood wounding or whatever it is. I'm choosing this because it calls my soul, my spirit, my core self forward as compelling in and of itself. So that's one way it goes down, right? And then there's whole sets of different schools of teachers and gurus around this who would, of course, vet students and give them, years and even decades of practices building up to setting a good foundation, a good, well built up nervous system to be able to deal with these kinds of experiences. There are teachings and esoteric nuances to these experiences. There's we're talking about the like center, the crown jewel, the deep experience that informs these profoundly detailed, rich mystical practices that modern therapists have just plucked the jewel out and are trying to use as this therapeutic tool. And while I do think there are ways that that can be done, they're taking it completely out of the context that it organically arose in, and missing a lot of perhaps the important information that would come with that context, right? Another way that this would go down traditionally is people would sometimes organically on their own, through whatever fate, karma, good fortune, happenstance, whatever, however you want to think of it, some people occasionally will just naturally have a mystical experience on their own, right? This happens sometimes, often in childhood, or like kind of like childhood to tween years or teen years. Sometimes people don't even mean to, they just have a mystical experience, sometimes around sleep or sleeping and waking. Sometimes in old age, sometimes middle age. Like there are stories of people who were just normal, mothers and fathers and members of households who had a mystical experience one day and then became monks and adepts of these practices. So the other way that this often would go down historically is just either someone's called to it, or they just had their own experience and then they're seeking context for it. They're seeking understanding and connection for what that was and why that happened. And again, that's a really different thing from pushing it on someone or telling them they have to have this experience when nothing about their life experience or their orientation is about seeking deep spirituality, seeking deep, profound, non-dual, mystical, God realized enlightenment type experiences. Some people have no hunger for that. They're not organized around that. And yet these therapists want to push people towards that, again, under the guise of this being beneficial therapeutically. So I want to add a little bit about my own experience here back into this conversation at this point and share what I found. So I know I told you earlier in this video that I had my first experience when I was 17 and that it became a deep foundational experience in my life, all very true. And that then I went on to pursue that more consistently, more regularly through spiritual studies, spiritual practices, esoteric learnings, et cetera, all very true. And of course, heaps of psychedelics along the way. Let's be real about that. All very true. Now, I've also, while I was doing this, I was living in California in a very new age place, surrounded by other people who, generally speaking, were on similar trajectories. Okay. So of course, birds of a feather kind of a thing, flock together. I find kindred spirits who are also using psychedelics and interweaving that with, these esoteric traditional practices, pursuing the non-dual very sincerely, some of them with very traditional practices, some of them very kind of, psychedelic heavy. But there were a lot of other people that I saw also reaching for this same experience, right? So I got not only to see my own personal experience up close firsthand through trial and error here, but I got to see a lot of other people also go down this path. Okay. Now, if you've watched my content for a while, you probably already know what I'm about to say, but so pardon the redundance if you do, but just to spell it out and make it clear here, what I found, okay, so a lot of those people, including myself, if you unpack their personal histories, trauma is a common denominator. Okay. They're often, and that's not just pointing the finger at seekers here. I think this is just kind of fairly universal. A lot of us have some trauma growing up to undo and heal. And I think when we get into psychedelics, when we're like really using them as a tool and having these profound experiences, it starts to feel like this is the way to undo that, right? Because it does give you relief, right? Even if you're not having a non-dual mystical experience. If you do have a non-dual mystical experience, like the science says, you're going to get like a longer tail of relief off of that experience, right? So again, it can really suggest that this is the way forward. But what I found over and over is that not only would my trauma patterns show up again, often just a few days later, or a week later or something, Suddenly the neuroses comes back, a little bit of the depression, some of the anxiety, some of the like comfort seeking, some of the, dopamine seeking activities, some of the, the sense of like all the attachment wounds starting to come back and my sense of relationships getting all wonky. Long story short, what I found is that these experiences, no matter how intense they were, no matter how profound they were, generally did not undo the trauma I was carrying and generally did not undo the attachment wounds I was, dealing with that I didn't have language for back then. And if I'm to be honest, when I look at my peers on the path, I see the same thing for them. Okay. So what I've seen over and over and over, sadly, I wish it were different. I wish we could eat a bunch of mushrooms for 2 years and gain enlightenment, and then all our trauma goes away, and we just, rise up to this higher vibrational level and stay there, and it's wonderful. That would be great. If it was that simple, I'm all about it. But what I found over and over is that that simply didn't work. And quite frankly, most of the people I know on that path are still struggling with their own trauma patterning, depending on how open they are to understanding that that's what's going on and open to looking at how to therapeutically heal that, right? So I've seen some people make great strides, and I see other people, again, my age, who are still stuck with their trauma patterns, because trauma patterns are fairly enduring unless we actively know how to work on them and undo them. So all of this is to say, from my point of view, and again, deep down that rabbit hole, lots of deep, deep, deep spiritual experiences and profound breakthrough awakenings, profound moments and ecstasy like you wouldn't believe. And I don't mean the drug, I mean the state, the experience of just profound spiritual illumination and ecstasy and just being blasted wide open with love and oneness and full ego dissolution, and getting good at that, having that happen fairly easily, and being on one level profoundly educated and nourished and expanded from those experiences. But still, again, when the rubber meets the road, when we're talking practicals here, did it undo the trauma pattern? No. No matter how high I got, no matter how deep I went, no matter how profound the transmission, it didn't. And again, I feel comfortable sharing that because I know that's not just like some misalignment on my part. I know that when I look around, I see the same thing. And quite frankly, when I look at the kind of modern current new age community and secret community and people in all the different psychedelic traditions, or, the kind of tangential yoga world of people who have obviously done a lot of psychedelics, you still see a lot of trauma patterns there too. Okay. So let's be clear here. From my point of view, at least my perspective is that mystical experiences don't in and of themselves heal trauma, just to put it point blank. I want to unpack that more with you, but that was really important to lay in the center of this video. So coming back around to the psychedelics side of things, and particularly the psychedelic therapy side of things, let's talk about how this is going down for clients, okay? Not always, but often, in order to get a client to one of these kinds of non-dual experiences, if it's going to happen, and that's an if, right? Often this is done through high dose sessions, especially if we're talking, say, psilocybin, right? So these are higher dose sessions. And let me just share my thoughts on what I understand about why they're doing high dose sessions. And again, my own thoughts about high dose work. Okay. So my understanding is that they're doing high dose sessions, again, to try to essentially blow the person right past their ego, blow the person right past their identity, right past anything that could resemble resistance, and just basically nuke them with psychedelics so that they can't fight it, essentially. And this is a strategy. I know I have friends who that's how they roll. If they're going to do psychedelics, they go hard because they want to try to avoid that anxiety and the come up, which we could talk about another time. But this is a strategy that I think is being employed a lot by these therapists. So these sessions tend to be high dose sessions. Okay. Now, from my point of view, and this is a bit controversial because higher dose seems to be very in vogue right now in the psychedelic therapy space. Okay. I've done plenty of high dose experiences myself. In my experience, that is high when, especially if we're talking someone who's new to psychedelic therapy and new to psychedelics and doesn't have the priming themselves and working up to it and the willingness and the readiness. This is all new and it's about healing and about resolving, help me fix myself. It's that whole set around it. It's that whole mindset around it, right? High dose sessions tend to be high risk and potentially high reward. Okay. So when you do a high dose session with someone, there is much more of a risk that things go sideways, that if it's going to be sad or painful or difficult, or if they have like a panic attack and have a true classic bad trip, it's going to be intense, right? Because everything's so vivid on a high dose experience. If it goes well, and it is, again, a roll of the dice, because what we know from the neuroscience of psychedelics is that every time you take them, they're going to cause new and different brain crosstalk, between regions in ways that your brain has never crosstalked before, which means different neural circuits get activated every time. Sometimes that's awesome. Sometimes that's really hard or really weird or everything else, right? So with a high dose session, what happens is if it goes well, awesome. You may have just made a big dent in something, or you may have at least given that person a strong enough experience that they will have a really good afterglow and a nice long tail of, reduction in their symptoms. And again, a lot of therapists just thinking in terms of symptoms, not root cause or, blah, blah, blah. So at its best, it can really pay off and be amazing. And I've had moments in my own life, and I've seen a lot of other people who, after a big experience that was really beautiful, they're doing great for a while, right? So, when it works, but it's high risk. Again, psychedelics are unpredictable. They really can pivot on a dime to go from amazing to horrifying and everything in between. Strange, weird, confusing, beautiful, anxiety provoking, and at that level, if we're talking therapy here, really transference provoking, right? So it's really easy for people to not recognize the feelings happening in their own body, which are loud and big and overwhelming, not recognize their environment, not recognize their sitter or their guide or their therapist, and end up projecting all kinds of stuff in all kinds of directions, both towards themselves and it can be messy. Okay. So this is one of the major downsides to this approach. Now, not all of these therapists are doing high dose sessions. Sometimes these, they're doing moderate doses or they're trying to, but generally to have a mystical experience, especially for someone who's never had one before, it requires being fairly high in psychedelics to get there. High enough that your ego melts. Okay. So however high that would be to you, that's what they're shooting for here, right? So, point made, this really is a risky thing just in and of itself. And unfortunately, what can happen is a whole host of things, right? So again, I want to reiterate here that the dynamic I'm hearing about and seeing a lot is people being pushed into this. Maybe they're doing their best to align with it and agree with it, or they're open-minded to it, but they're doing it in this context of therapy and fixing themselves, right? And they're doing it to heal. They're not doing it out of their own natural pursuit of this type of experience. Often these, again, high dose, very intense, and very goal-oriented, which is not always good for therapy either, necessarily. And what can happen, so the obvious thing is re-traumatization. Okay. People can end up reliving old traumas that they've suppressed, that now they have no structure to be able to manage that or portion out being activated. So they just get all the activation of all the memory and all the reliving of it, which, if not handled very skillfully in that moment, can deepen that trauma and re-traumatize that person and amplify that traumatic experience. So there's a real risk here of people ending up with their symptoms being worse and their trauma literally being added onto from these experiences. Okay. Another major thing that can happen is essentially some experience of spiritual abuse, right? This is not unlike, in certain respects, people belonging to a religion that is forcing them to believe a certain thing or see God in a certain way or have a certain kind of approach or relationship to God that feels forceful and unfair. And what can end up happening is that it can wound the desire to want to connect with God and the desire to want to explore one's own spiritual experiences and spiritual self, spiritual life, because that all gets colored through this filter of force and coercion and control and being hemmed into a particular belief system or frame of understanding, rather than allowing that person to organically make their own sense and explore that territory in their own time, in their own way, and discover their own personal, authentic relationship to the spiritual. So again, not only can it re-traumatize, but it can spiritually wound people and it can spiritually traumatize them. And quite frankly, that is the deepest layer of our being. So spiritual wounds are no small thing. That's not a joke. That's deep. That's really deep to do that to someone. And so this is another way that this can end up really, really harming people. Let me see, looking at my list here. Right. So another thing that this can do, and I want to explain why here, but let's just, again, go through the downsides here. Another thing that this can do is it can end up inadvertently strengthening the resistance, right? So people can end up feeling resistant a bit to therapy or to healing because it doesn't entirely feel safe. Maybe they don't, feel comfortable with a therapist. Maybe they don't trust their own deeper contents of their mind and they're afraid to go there. And that's kind of an edge for them. There could be a lot of reasons why someone is feeling resistant. And resistance is a part of authentic autonomy, right? So, for example, children being forced to eat food they don't want to eat and they throw a fit, right? What is that? That's an assertion of autonomy, of control over one's own experience and one's own body, right? So if we're using medicine, especially high dose medicine, to push people way past where they're willing to go, where they're ready to go, they may go, beyond what they're comfortable with, but it may not be this blissful, ecstatic, revelatory experience. And either in the session, it can create resistance, or afterwards, it can really, when the person's ego and identity structure comes back online and they're working as normal again, they can have, their resistance can double down. And then this, of course, just makes the whole process harder from there. Right? So this is another real big kind of side effect or downside to this approach. And the other one that I want to give voice here to, which is incredibly unfair, is what if the person, they took the medicine, they're like, okay, I'm going to do this. I trust this therapist. I'm going to go for it. And the therapist is pushing them. The person gets into the experience and does not have a non-dual experience. And then they, come down and maybe they feel a little disappointed and the therapist is like, well, okay, another time. Then they try again and they still don't have a non-dual experience. And they try again and they still don't have a non-dual experience. After a few of these attempts, the person can start to feel like there's something wrong with them. Like, what's wrong with me? I must be broken. And there can be this kind of deep sense of shame and wrongness for, quote unquote, and I'm major air quotes here, failing to have a non-dual experience. So this is one of these problems with like this kind of goal-oriented push with a client, is that instead of meeting them where they're at and helping them to, move that organically towards healing, which is entirely possible with this kind of forceful approach, if the result isn't gotten, what can end up happening is a sense of, oh, it's me, there's something wrong with me, I'm broken, especially if the person already has trauma. As we know, one of the major symptoms of trauma, one of the major things that trauma does is generate like a lot of a sense of shame. And it's very easy for people who have a history of trauma to go there, to end up blaming themselves, right? So this is another major risk, is really reinforcing some negative self-perception for the client. Okay, so now that you know a bit about how this can end up hurting people and damaging them, let's talk about why it's damaging. So why would being pushed in this way end up hurting people, besides having these reamplification? What's the real damaging piece there? And what is it specifically that these therapists are perhaps not considering or not seeing about their approach that's causing them to end up damaging these clients? Let's unpack that a bit here, because this is really what I want you to understand. This is exactly why on this channel I've pivoted to talking so much about relationships and attunement and attachment theory, and I go on and on about it, and why I've built a whole course around using attachment theory to heal trauma and undo attachment wounds, and why this is kind of my whole mission now. It's exactly because of getting this wrong and the damage that it can do when we get this wrong. So I want you to really clearly listen and understand what I'm about to say here. Okay, this is really important, especially, hey, if you're a therapist, if you're a psychedelic therapist, please listen to what I have to say here, because this is the difference that makes the difference. Okay, so why does this harm people? So I want you to think about it through this lens. When we are using medicine at a high dose to essentially push a person's nervous system or force them to transcend their own identity, to move past their sense of self, right? And we're essentially breaking any resistance by just like brute force with these medicines. I want you to think about what is the underlying message that this set of actions and this framing and this approach is sending to that person's nervous system. Okay. What are the underlying messages being sent in this way of relating, in this relational approach that these therapists are taking? So some obvious examples here would be that there's a message saying you need to be different than how you are right now, right? Or you have to submit to force, or how you feel doesn't matter. If you're uncomfortable with this, it doesn't matter. Okay. Or you have to break a part of yourself in order to heal. Right? These are all some of the implied, there's more, but these are a few of the implied messages in this course of action. Right? And so those messages, especially, let's say the person comes from a personal history, whether it was their family life or early school life or whatever, they come from a personal history of getting those types of messages as points of traumatic relational wounding in their past. Right? So just think about that. If we're sending these messages saying you have to be different, you have to submit to force, you have to break a part of yourself, you're not okay the way you are, and those are messages they got early on, that's going to be all kinds of rewounding. And this is a massive blind spot for therapists and even people DIYing psychedelic therapy. This is why we've got to get the relating part right. Here's another reason why this is so damaging. Okay. So if you think about it, it's pretty obvious if you just slow down and think about it here you can tell I'm all passionate about this, right? If we think about it for a moment, the wound is in the personal. The wound is in the ego. The wound is in the identity, in the personal history, in the personal narrative. It's in the sense of self. The wound is not in the transcendent all one. Okay? So in a certain sense, when we are trying to push the client to go for the transcendent all one, we are telling them, we're moving them away from where the healing needs to happen. Okay? Bear with me here. So if we're moving this person away from where the healing needs to happen taking them to this other experience in their nervous system that's beyond a sense of self, then that sense of self carrying the wound never gets to be heard or seen or supported or connected to or helped to release whatever needs releasing or rewire whatever needs rewiring or create that healing change. We're just kind of, in a certain sense, kind of abandoning that part of that person by pushing them into the transpersonal. Now, if the person has abandonment wounds as part of how they ended up, with trauma in the first place, and we're then kind of using that to abandon them, it's the dynamic is exactly going to re-traumatize the person, right? I feel like kind of bringing in, before we pivot to better solutions here, because I have something to say about that. I feel like kind of bringing back around what I'd mentioned earlier, which is that, remember I said a lot of therapists haven't done their own attachment work and aren't self-aware of how their own insecure attachment style might be distorting the way they understand the client or what the client needs. Do you remember that? Let's bring that back in right here. So if what I see a lot, therapists do tend to skew. I don't see so many disorganized therapists. I see quite a few therapists who are actually avoidant, which is really interesting, because avoidant attachment essentially is fear of being overwhelmed by other people's emotions. But sometimes that drives people to become actually really good at helping other people to manage their emotions, because that feels more comforting. But in avoidant attachment, what we often have is someone who ends up inadvertently, often unconsciously, sometimes on purpose, being dismissive towards other people's feelings or felt experience or personal experience. So you may end up with a psychedelic therapist who has avoidant attachment, who is dismissive of these places where you feel you need to be seen and understood and met and connected with and healed. They might just want to use the medicine to gloss over that with a form of spiritual bypassing. Okay? If the therapist is anxious, they're more likely to tune into that stuff with you. But again, same thing, a lot of anxiously attached people also love to have these transcendent experiences, these non-dual experiences, because it can tend to remove all of the anxiety that's present in anxious attachment. Okay, so again, there can be an overzealotry there because the therapist hasn't healed their own attachment system and is then misunderstanding what needs to happen because their own lens of relationship is distorted and not quite balanced yet. Okay, so this is how we end up with therapists. Again, this is why not seeing the relational thing happens, because therapists are wounded themselves, they haven't done their own healing work, and then they're glossing over and not really catching what is the message I'm sending this person's nervous system with this approach, right? So I hope that makes sense. Really important point. With that being said, since this is surely a very long video by this point, let's get into what the better way here is, because there is an alternative way to do all this. Okay, so let me share my thoughts about that with you. Okay, so now that I've probably thoroughly bummed you out, let me share with you a little bit of what I see being a better alternative. So I want to be constructive as we end this video, share what I think is a better way to go about this, because there is a better way. So why not use it, right? And again, I want to just kind of say that for me, this is a weird stance to be taking, because again, I'm a huge fan of non-dual experiences and they've been a huge part of my life and I think they're really beautiful, but they have to be in the right moment for the right reason, in the right context, done the right way, because these are such deep, powerful experiences. If we misuse that power because we're misattuned, we can do a lot of damage. And one thing I forgot to say earlier from my own personal experience is when I went through my psychedelic zealotry phase, because I went through it too, and I tried to push this type of experience on others, generally it didn't go well. Generally, they would often not have a non-dual experience, or if they did, sometimes it wasn't all that beautiful or ecstatic or revelatory for them the way it was for me. And then, a certain set of friends got huge benefit out of it and, and had some beautiful, beautiful transformations. But it was not 100% hit rate, like there were definitely people out there who I was like, hey, this and this, and they just did not resonate with it. It was just not for them at that moment. So this is something, again, I think these therapists should be thinking about. Okay, rant over. Let me share with you a little bit about what I think some of the solutions here are, because there is a better way. Okay. So I want to give you a little bit of a metaphor here that I share with clients often, which is how to think about this process of healing and the nervous system. And the way I think of it is like a flower unfolding. Okay, so our nervous system as it heals is very much organically this process of unfolding itself and undoing the corners and, quirky wrinkle kinks of our being that have not seen the light of consciousness for a long time. And just like a flower opening. And because that's kind of how this process goes, we want to think of it the way we would think of supporting a flower to unfold itself. So the thing I say to my clients all the time is you can't rip a flower open to make it bloom, right? You can't take a closed up flower bud and just aggressively rip it open through force and expect it to be beautiful or smell good or be the full expression of that flower. If you do that, you destroy the flower, obviously, right? I think the same thing is true here with using force in healing. We have to, like a flower, give it the right environment, the right container, the right, with a flower, it would be good soil and good light and good air and clean water and right nutrients. With a human being, it's more like a patient approach that's compassionate, that's attuned, that's respectful, that's, honoring that person's rhythms and resistances, that is connected, that is safe, that is loving and respectful of that person's entire nervous system, right? That is curious and patient. I said that already. You get my point. There's a way to go about this that allows the nervous system to unfold itself of its own accord. And then what we get is the full beauty of that flower. We get the full beauty of that human being. And it's profound. It's exquisite. It's a huge reason I do what I do is the gift and the joy and the honor of being present with someone as their full self starts to flower and unfold. It's amazing. So we want to think of this again, like not ripping the flower open. Okay. Another huge piece, and again, there are different schools of thought on this, and this is something that I kind of learned through my hypnosis trainings. It's also something I learned through my somatic therapy trainings, is understanding resistance for what it really is. Okay. So there are a lot of therapists and a lot of people doing self-directed therapy who think of resistance in terms of it being an obstacle in the way to whatever the core material is or whatever needs accessing, the core memory, the core belief, however you want to think of it. There are different models of therapy. But the thought is often that the resistance is the junk in the way, right? It's the problem, it's the obstacle, it's the boulder, it's the damn tree that fell in the middle of the road that's stopping us from progressing forward. I don't think that's accurate. In my experience, the way to understand this is the resistance is often the wound coming up. The resistance is the deeper system, the unconscious mind, if you want to use hypnosis language, presenting the wound. It's just that we are not recognizing it for what it really is, usually. So a big part of what makes this go the right way is instead of this trying to force a person past resistance, when we get resistance, slow down, listen up. Eyes open. What is this resistance? Let's unpack it. Let's get curious about that because that's where the wound is most of the time. Okay. So if we're slowing down, we're not ripping the flower open. We are not fighting the resistance. We are working with the resistance, kind of like a little bit like Aikido here, right? Like in Aikido, they take the momentum of someone coming at you and they throw the person. They use that momentum, right? Same thing with resistance. We're using that resistance here to get curious about what the wounding is rather than trying to push back on the resistance. Another really important point here is, again, as I've kind of alluded to just a couple minutes ago, getting the relational part right first, because this creates it's not quite the right way to put it, but this unlocks the nervous system. Okay, when we get the relational part right first, meaning that we're sending the right signals to the person's deeper system through the situation being correct, by the listening, by the being with, by the patience, by the honoring the person, by the not pushing them. When we get that part right, and the person's system, and this isn't even a conscious process, this is an unconscious process, starts to recognize, oh, wait, I'm safe with this in this situation. It's going to be okay. That's often exactly when the nervous system starts to unfold like a flower and starts to like open up, right? That's where we start to get access to some of this core material if we need it. But we get it volunteered from that person's deeper system, from its own inner healing intelligence, not from us trying to force our way in there aggressively. Okay? That's a very different ethos from this like, ply them open with psychedelics approach. It's just a very different mindset. And in general, what I find, and this is something I've really borrowed heavily from somatic therapy, and let me be transparent here, all my training in hypnosis is all about fast. It's all about get results quick, outcomes, create the change. Fast change is good, right? In somatic therapy, they completely have the opposite ethos, which is slow and smooth. Slow, smooth, patient, and emphasizing connectedness. Connectedness is that safety signal that the nervous system needs to know that it can unfold itself. And that is safe connectedness, not just any connection, but safe connection. So if we slow down and we really connect with a person and we connect with the issue in a respectful, caring, patient way that's not about outcome, that's not about pushing, that's not about controlling, but just about listening and being with, the nervous system, once it starts to get that signal, will volunteer what it wants to heal. It's like it goes into self-healing mode and it starts to volunteer what it wants to heal. And instead of having to push our way in there with psychedelics, things start opening and moving on their own. And that's, I think, a better way. It's non-violent. It's patient. It's compassionate. The person who is healing has some say in the matter, right? Their voice, their experience matters in this immensely. And it's a negotiated dance towards healing, rather than kind of like a more of a dominator and submitter kind of dynamic, which is often how it goes with these high dose sessions. Is like, here I am, the expert therapist. I'm going to give you 7 grams of mushrooms and you're going to just submit and be on the ride and you're going to deal with it. And then you're going to heal from it. Like that's often kind of the implicit dynamic in a lot of these sessions. Okay. So I think this gentler, patient, connected, slower way, weirdly enough, and I'm saying this pragmatically. I'm not saying this because I'm biased towards that approach. I've tried many other approaches to helping people heal. This is just what works. And it actually ends up working the fastest in my experience. Okay. So if we were to bring psychedelics into that ethos, often what that looks like is low to moderate doses instead of high doses, on the back of an established kind of momentum of connection between the therapist and the client that feels really safe and really in agreement, really in alignment, really, the attachment side of things is good, right? It's a very secure attachment between the client and the therapist. And then, when the medicine comes in, the client has some say, some control, and often this ends up going, again, instead of pushing the client away from the personal towards the transpersonal with these high doses and these mystical experiences, which I think are beautiful and profound, we are leaning into where the personal is. And the system, the person's nervous system, will show the therapist and show the client, for that matter, what needs healing. If there's real listening there, if there's real attention there. So this is the other way to go. And again, this is something that was modeled a little bit by me, by some of, for me, not by me, for me, by some of my mentors. And is something that I'm just also picking up as I'm talking with other the really skilled psychedelic therapists that I meet, who are not just giving people psychedelics and then, kind of just chilling and trip sitting and occasionally doing some guide work, but the ones who are really actively helping people heal, people doing MDMA therapy, for example, that kind of stuff. These therapists are often, it's much more this ethos I'm talking about: slow, attuned, attachment-based, trauma-informed, not pushing for big experiences that blow the person out, but establishing this safety that really does unlock the nervous system and allow it to do its own self-healing. Here's the real bottom line, and I guess we'll wrap this insanely long video with this. What I've learned along the way from all my studies and all my exploration of the unconscious mind and the nervous system and healing and how does this thing all work, right? What I've really come to understand is that it is the deeper unconscious mind, inner healing, intelligence, core self, however you want to think of that. There's a deep intelligence inside every human being's body that knows how to self-heal, that has the power to self-heal. It's just waiting for the right environment and circumstance and recognition and permission to do its self-healing thing. This is what keeps showing itself to me over and over and over. It's our job to meet that and support that and interact with that respectfully and in the right way to maximize the potential of the inner healing intelligence doing its dang thing, okay? That's how this really works. Okay. So your therapist isn't your healer. No one is your healer. Your own system has the power. It's just about interacting with it in a way that gives it that room to do that. So I hope that makes sense. So let me just kind of wrap the video, since I've just kind of rambled at length with you guys here, and we'll call it a video. So in summary, I know this has been a big, long video and a bit of a heavy topic here, but again, important to make. Some of the things I want to just kind of recap here. So first of all, I personally think that pushing people into non-dual experiences as a strategy to heal, especially if they're not authentically choosing it on their own, is unethical. I think that is sets people up into a web of dynamics that are unfair, that are full of pressure, that are stressful, that generally work against their ability to heal. In my experience, to double down on that point, having run the experiment a lot of times on myself and seen a lot of others do similar, spiritual experiences, non-dual experiences, mystical experiences, as profound and beautiful and life-affirming and possibly the deepest thing you could experience as they are, they don't tend to heal trauma from what I see. Okay. So this approach, I think there's a way to do it, but this approach by and large isn't just going to deliver healing in and of itself because the person had a big spiritual experience. They may feel great afterwards. They may feel at peace and blissful and spiritually charged up, but the trauma symptoms will come back, is what I found over and over. Okay. More to the point, there's an underlying relational thing in the therapeutic approach that needs to be healthy and right, that is based on understanding attachment work and understanding secure attachment. And, just to kind of remind you again, there are a lot of therapists out there who have not done their own attachment work and therefore might be blind to this subtle relational approach and the impact and the message that sends to your nervous system. So please, if you're going to go do psychedelic therapy, be very careful about that. It's really important that they've done their own attachment work and they're attachment informed and mindful of that in this work. Force with psychedelic therapy, big dose sessions, can be very damaging and very wounding, and it's very high risk. And I don't see that really being the way so much. What I do see being the way, just to kind of summarize this, is a much gentler, more nuanced, more attuned, slower approach that is very much centered on creating a sense of connection and a sense of safety. That's much more focused on lower doses and encouraging the person's inner healing intelligence to do what it's designed to do, which is heal. And that's all about the signals we're sending the person's nervous system, way more than it is about the medicine, the type of medicine, or the dose, or, any of that. So these are my thoughts on the matter for now. Again, I know I've rambled at length here, but if you have stuff to say about this, I would love to know your thoughts. Leave the comments down below. Engage with me around this. Do you disagree? Did I say something that totally lit up an idea for you and you're like, wow, holy shit, never thought of that? Or the other way around where you're like, I really don't agree with that. Or whatever your perspective is, it would be most welcome in the comment section down below. I'm going to go for now because this is a lot of video to be shooting in one shot here. Much love to you guys. Take care. Thank you for being aboard for the ride. And for anyone who's made it this far, just so you know, like I said, I'm going to be shooting more, posting more here on YouTube, and they're not always going to be, hour-long videos like this. So anyways, I'll see you guys soon. Take care.